So let's begin here with Pancho Villa, real name Jose Doroteo Arango, and ask this question: terrorist or freedom fighter? It's tough. It really is tougher than you might think. And according to Walzer, at least, you can kind of see the trajectory of the conception of terrorism, both from the perspective of the people who suffer terrorism to the terrorists themselves, has changed throughout time. So terrorism pre-World War II mostly took the form of targeted assassinations, Walzer says. For example, of course, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln is politically motivated, political violence, right? So that would be terrorism, and it was targeted. It was the president of the Union. Also, another American president assassinated by this time an anarchist terrorist. So William McKinley was shot, and that is actually why Theodore Roosevelt was promoted to president, I believe. In any case, this is another case of terrorism targeting their victim, right? It isn't just random murder. It is a specific person, again, the President of the United States. Of course, this also happened in Europe, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, who was next in line for the throne. This was by a Serbian nationalist, and of course, again, it is targeted, right? So that's the theme here. Last example that I'll give you from this pre-World War II era is the 1920 Wall Street bombing. Again, anarchists, who leftists typically have a special kind of ire for banks and what they call the banksters, or any kind of financing institutions that are maybe self-interested in their pursuits, right? So leftists tend to have some qualms about that. And so here the anarchists bombed Wall Street itself. So these are clearly targeted, more so targeted than today's terrorism. So Walzer says that it was because of World War II, when both the Axis powers and the Allied powers ratcheted up their strategy of targeting civilians so that civilians would request an end to the war. It was during this period that I guess it was almost like the idea was born where, oh, terrorism can target civilians instead, or maybe should target civilians instead. But let's talk first about World War II. This was, of course, a nasty, nasty conflict, the worst ever, really. And during this time period, it made sense to bomb the home front, right? Not only the armies, but also the people that make munitions. And, you even invade areas because of their natural resources. For example, Germany, Nazi Germany, invaded Norway for their iron ore. So that's kind of, the idea behind total war, which even more so than World War I, World War II was a total war. And so eventually it just makes sense to start bombing civilians, right? So the Germans did this to the British. All the Allies basically did it to the Germans in return. The Americans did it to the Japanese. So this is something, it's a natural progression, one might say, of total war. This is not to say that it is morally justified. It is to say that this tends to happen when the goal is complete capitulation, when it is unconditional surrender. This tends to happen. That just is what happens historically. So apparently it is from that point, basically after World War II, that the strategy of terror is primarily used against random civilians. Like the idea was born at that point, or it was already there, as I'll give you an example in a second, but now it predominantly takes the form of targeting random civilians. This is so, presumably, that the civilians will demand of their government whatever it is the terrorists are requesting. So this is pre-World War II, but just to show you, this was around before World War II. So the suffragette bombing campaign was before World War II, but the point here is not to say that it didn't exist before World War II, but just that after World War II, it was the dominant method or approach to terrorism. The Weather Underground is definitely, after World War II, they were active during the Vietnam War. And yeah, they basically sided with, they're an interesting group of people. They sided with Black Power and against the Vietnam War. What they were really after was the actual overthrow of the U.S. government. Now, it's hard to say whether they were even remotely had any probability of success, but they were active during a time period, targeting pretty randomly. The Unabomber targeting pretty randomly. I mean, you know, he's called Unabomber because he would target universities and airlines because he's against technology in general. But outside of that general domain of anything that has to do with technology, it was pretty random. So again, the strategy has changed here. And then there's this guy, that's pretty random. The Earth Liberation Front, they are an environmentalist activist group. And they are not too random. They do target private property that is having to do with anything that might pollute the environment, basically, or scientists and things like that. So they're not too random, but within that general wheelhouse, it'll be, you know, anyone who is, for example, in the oil industry counts. I mean, they're fair game, that kind of thing. So it is certainly more random than pre-World War II. And of course, I mean, you know, jihad terrorism is the most common, and it is kind of known for its randomness. So it is the case that there really is, Walzer seems to be making a good point, there really is a random flavoring to modern terrorism. So with this in mind, here's the question that we really want to cover when we're asking the question about Pancho Villa. You know, is he a terrorist or some kind of revolutionary? Well, here's what we're really asking. If the cause is just, right, if it's to overthrow a tyrant, can an act of terror be morally justified? So, Walzer, who is the person we've been covering in this lesson so far, comes down pretty strongly on the case that modern terrorism is not okay. So modern terrorism is always wrong because it is just a random murder of innocent people. Now, this is my own summary of what he's saying, so I should clarify here. It's mostly the random murder of innocent people. I mean, it could still be targeted. It generally seems to not be targeted, though. It is just really random civilians. If terrorism is a revolutionary action, then the targets should be agents of oppression. So he makes a good point there. It seems like the people in, you know, the World Trade Center on September 11th had nothing to do with the presence of military troops and bases in the Middle East. They weren't the people that, you know, put them there. So it seems pretty clearly, you know, random civilians, not at all targeted to the people who are actually responsible for the, you know, base camps and all that. So that is Walzer's perspective, and he does add an important, not caveat, but, you know, an important feature of his view in general, that military action has to come from the right authority. It has to be the state. Now, he stresses this over and over again in multiple contexts, and he emphasizes that non-state military actions are simply illegitimate. Now, the idea here is that the state trains its soldiers to minimize civilian death and such. And that's the general idea from the just war theorist. Basically, if I can put the just war theory in a nutshell, you can do good in the world with your army. It's certainly possible, right? So it's not just about self-defense. You can stop aggression abroad and do good things with it. But it has to be your army that's trained to do that. That's sort of the main just war theory approach. So with that said, now we can go into McPherson's views, and he's actually the focus of this video, even if it doesn't seem like it yet. But all of this, you know, you can also find in McPherson's paper, 2007 paper. And he's given some talks since then. But here is how McPherson is going to go after Walzer's view. He's going to begin by asking some probing questions. What gives military professionals political and/or moral legitimacy? Well, We already mentioned this briefly, but here it is again. The dominant view, or Walser's view, or just war theory, these are all the same thing, claims properly trained combatants will minimize incidental loss of civilian life. But, of course, in practice, commanders prefer to protect their own soldiers at the expense of civilians. Now, this happens over and over and over again, so it really is difficult to see where the just war theorists are coming from in saying that, professional armies kind of minimize incidental loss of civilian life. They seem to not. So let's just say you have a village and it would cost you 5, of your soldier, you're a general, and it would cost you 5 of your soldiers to rescue 5 innocent civilians inside the captured village. Odds are you just pass it by and you don't lose 5 of your men for 5 innocent civilians. And it makes certain tactical sense to do that. But the idea here is that reliably, it's the case that commanders prefer their own soldiers to non-combatants. So maybe you don't even need a hypothetical example. That is literally exactly what the reasoning was, at least according to the conventional view, of the atomic bombings. Right? Their civilian life seemed to be less valuable than the soldiers that would be expended during the land invasion. I guess you would call it an amphibious assault, but in any case, the idea here is too many soldiers would be lost during an invasion. So instead we'll drop atomic bombs on largely a civilian population, right? So that is a clear example of commanders preferring their own soldiers over civilians. And he adds that conventional war actually causes more death than terrorism. So, this is just a simple numbers thing. And yes, it is definitely the case that war has caused far more death than terrorism. If you no matter how you slice it, you can do the last 20 years or you can do the last 100 years or whatever. Pretty much it's always the case that war causes more civilian death than terrorism. The best example, of course, is World War II. That's when the most amount of civilians perished. About 2/3 of total loss of life during World War II was non-combatant. So that's a combination, obviously. Again, if it's total war that one is engaging in, where your opponent has to completely capitulate, right, unconditional surrender, then all sorts of things are going to start happening, right? The internment camps were also part of the racial ideology of the Germans, but the terror bombings, those were just a feature of total war. That's just kind of what makes sense during total war, and you can tell because both sides did it. So there is a whole lot of loss of life in conventional warfare, and sometimes it's easy to not notice this when it's your side doing it. So that's going to be a point that I make a little more clearly later. In any case, McPherson continues. Just war theorists also claim that professionals make a moral distinction between civilians and military personnel. But some groups responsible for terrorism have also done this, as shown by their claims that this is a last resort. So the group that McPherson has in mind is the African National Congress, and it has some famous figures in this picture. You can see Nelson Mandela behind the microphone, not at the microphone, but literally look at the microphone and then look behind it, and that's Mandela. Anyway, so the African National Congress was eventually deemed a terrorist group because it did engage in acts of terror. But, of course, it was to overthrow an unfair social order, right? So that was the idea. And they also, it seems like, and I'm not an expert on the history of South Africa, but it seems like they really did try to exhaust their alternatives before they turned violent. So, and of course, that's what McPherson reports as well. So it really does seem that some groups that have been called terrorist groups really did wait to utilize political violence until it was the last resort. So what's going on here is that if you look at Walser's criteria for a just war, if you take out that part about it having to be the state that does it, it almost seems like some terror groups or some groups that commit political violence can basically tick off all the other boxes, right, for the greater good and that kind of stuff, without being state actors. They would basically be non-state actors. They would just be, civilians committing political violence. And that's McPherson's main point here. So this is, I believe, a quote. Yes. If there is a just cause and no less harmful means available, we must take seriously whether these grounds could ever justify terrorism. Since the dominant view fails to make a clear moral distinction, we must either be more critical of conventional war or less critical of terror tactics. Now, he's using the label terror here pretty freely, but of course, the label terror itself comes in a morally loaded way. So I would kind of replace that word there with the word political violence, and then you can see more clearly his point. It seems like if we're okay with political violence, then we might have to kind of ease our criteria a little bit. It might be the case that if political violence can be justified generally, then it's not entirely clear why it has to be the state. Why does it have to be always a state, right? Maybe it could be a non-state actor. That's the idea here. Or let's just say that you don't think political violence is okay, well then you should be both critical of war and of terror. So it's kind of like this. It seems like terrorism, at least the way it is practiced by some groups that might also be called revolutionaries, right? So political violence could seem to have some moral backing to it. Moreover, war and terror, once you put it that way, they begin to look a lot like the same animal. So either you have to be accepting of both, more or less, or critical of both. Since they can be very similar, you basically, you can't take one and leave the other. Either you take both or you leave both. That's what McPherson is saying here. Now, McPherson is raising a very, I would say erudite point. He's making a point about the failure of the of just war theory to make these clear distinctions between, moral distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, the state and non-state actors. So McPherson is making this point, but I would like to dig a little further, and I think McPherson makes his point in other talks that he's given. But let's think about this for a second. Now, the Soviet Union, when they were the Soviet Union, invaded Afghanistan for reasons that I can't even begin to get into. But let's just say this. They found it necessary to prop up the Communist Party there in Afghanistan. So here is what happened. Operation Cyclone begins at this point. Obviously, the U.S. was in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. That basically means that they did fight each other, but primarily through proxies, right? So the Soviet Union would invade Afghanistan, let's just say, and the U.S. would essentially provide supplies for the Afghan people to fight against the Soviets. That's what it means to fight someone by proxy. So you don't fight them yourself, you give weaponry and training and money and all that to other people. So Operation Cyclone was began by Carter, continued by Reagan, and it's exactly what I just mentioned. You provide weapons, training, some advisors, money, which is needed for warfare. And the groups that they trained are, of course, Afghan rebels, right? So they were fighting against the Soviet Union, which makes a lot of sense. The Soviet Union was atheistic, and, in a profoundly Muslim country, that probably wasn't going to fly. But here are two things that are important about this. Here's the first thing. At that point, it was really easy to call them freedom fighters. So here's a quote literally from Ronald Reagan. to watch the courageous Afghan freedom fighters battle modern arsenals with simple handheld weapons is an inspiration to those who love freedom. So obviously, it's really easy to be on their side when they're fighting your enemy, the Soviet Union. But this same group of people, well, not the same group of people, but during this time, there was I think he's a billionaire, I don't know, millionaire, who was in the construction industry, and he actually left, I think, Pakistan to go to Afghanistan to start a base where he can train the mujahideen, right, these fighters, so they can combat the Soviet Union. This person that I'm talking about basically took all his construction equipment and made this base for training. This person, his name was Osama bin Laden. So this was a time period when Osama bin Laden was, technically on the same side as the U.S., right? Perhaps not a direct asset, but on the same side. And of course, afterwards, Osama bin Laden is known for being a terrorist, right? I mean, if you think the word terrorist, bin Laden might be one of the first people that pops up in your mind. So here's what's going on. Here's another way to put all this. Now, McPherson made this point. Here's the point that I want to make, with some glitches there in my presentation. But here's maybe another way to put it. Maybe what I want to dig out of there even further. There is no clear moral justification for state-sponsored violence, meaning for only state-sponsored violence, right? So it's either political violence is okay or it's not. And it doesn't really matter, it seems, whether it's from the state or from non-state actors. For example, it seems like a state invading some country that's committing, human rights atrocities is just as justified as the people in that country rebelling against their government for committing human rights atrocities. I mean, it seems like if one is okay, the other one's okay too. So here's what I want to dig out of here. We should be careful then to not hold a double standard where we consider acts of violence justified if they are for a cause we support, and consider those same acts not justified if they are for a cause we don't support. So it almost seems like political violence itself we are prone to finding it justified in terms of whether or not we agree with the cause. And we have to be careful there, right? It's because the moral distinctions aren't as strong as we wish they were, and that's one of many of McPherson's points. So to sum up McPherson's point, though, his actual point, though, it would be something like this. It seems like just war theory has failed to truly defend the position that it has to be the state. Instead, they only seem to have justified, maybe, we haven't really covered that, but maybe, that political violence is sometimes okay. And if that's the case, well, maybe non-state actors, just regular people committing political violence, it's possible that their actions can be justified too.